Hi, I'm Wade Lough, Associate Professor of Graphic Design, and welcome to our Longwood assessment session. This is my colleague,
Chris Register, Professor of Graphic and Animation Design.
And we're going to talk about addressing a common need with a measure for the common good for students. So I'd like to ask Chris a few questions, and he can tell you about the history of the assessment in the art department at Longwood. So Chris, can you shed some light on how the art department assessed students in the program when you started at Longwood?
Sure. It was 1998, and there was no formal assessment of students or the program to my knowledge. Freshmen were given a test which consisted of questions in studio art and art history. It was about 50 questions. This same test was administered to graduating seniors. Funny thing is that the faculty couldn't agree on the answers to many of the questions, and while the tests were scored, there was no analysis of the scores or curricular revisions that related to the test. We also conducted freshman-sophomore interviews, which was a project developed for each cohort by a faculty member, which was a research and response project. Juniors participated in a jury exhibition, and seniors participated in a senior exhibition that was connected with the capstone senior seminar.
But I suppose it was, at some point that changed. So what led the department to begin to assess more formally?
Oddly enough, in 2002, Longwood College at the time initiated a revamp of general education. The change that pushed the art department towards more comprehensive assessment was the addition of Goal 15, the mandatory internship. The department at the time had an enrollment nearing 200 students, and it was obvious that securing 200 internships or 50 a year for 4 years would be impossible, particularly in areas such as printmaking and drawing. At that time, the only department-wide assessments were 4 different benchmarks all art students had to meet: the freshman interview, sophomore interview, junior exhibition, and senior one-person exhibition. There was no document or written review of each student by the faculty, and no scores were given. There were no goals, no measures, no core competencies other than the freshman-senior test, and again, no data was collected to evaluate the program or groups of students in the program.
So it sounds as if there was no faculty buy-in to the idea of formal assessments.
Well, yes and no. In 2003, an independent group of faculty developed a yearly assessment program. This was in response to the internship requirement, the test no one could agree upon, dissatisfaction with irrelevant and opaque freshman-sophomore research questions, and dissatisfaction with the work being chosen and shown by juniors and seniors in their exhibitions. Now, students would be assessed every spring on work produced the previous semester and a half. First-year students would be assessed by foundations faculty. Second, third, and fourth-year students would be assessed by 2 faculty in their area of concentration. Juniors would also propose a senior professional project. This project was a 10-piece project on the theme of their choice and took from March of their junior year to March of their senior year to complete. Because Goal 15 had been rewritten as internships or directed study, we felt this senior project would qualify for the art and design majors for their Goal 15 requirement.
So you have the new assessments. Were they a burden in terms of faculty workload?
Not really. We were already conducting the interviews and the shows. The only real change was that the faculty in their area did the evaluation of the students instead of one person, which was usually the instructor of the capstone class.
So at what point do these new assessments take effect, and how about the common data that was being measured?
The new assessments went into effect in spring 2004. Data consisted of comments made on a comment sheet and the speaking intensive criteria rubric, which was added to the comment sheet for the freshmen and the seniors. The department kept a copy of these evaluations, and the student received a copy. Strangely, the catalog stated that students could fail the assessment and therefore be held back for a year or drop from their concentration. The department had no established means of doing this, however. 1 credit was added to the 2-credit senior seminar class as the internship credit. This was problematic administratively. A total of 3 students ever failed their assessments, and they either left the program or stayed out for 1 year because we told them to. No evaluation was done to the assessment sheets, and no curricular changes were made as a result of any assessment findings.
All right, so the new assessments were more formal, and they addressed student work at a common point in their careers. But they still seem to lack much of what we understand as a criteria necessary for a meaningful assessment. So how did the department address this?
Well, you remember for the entire academic year in 2009, you and I spent a considerable amount of time meeting and discussing about the assessments and the need to collect relevant measurable data. The results of this work were the basis of an assessment rubric for the graphic design concentration alone, based on a 100-point scale that evaluated 6 core competencies. Scores of 20 or less were considered failing scores. I also recommended to the department chair that the assessment process be overhauled, and the departmental assessment committee should gather and evaluate the assessment data and make suggestions to the departmental curriculum committee to align the curriculum with learning outcomes that were needed. The main role of the assessment committee up to this point was to schedule when the assessments were held, what room they were in, and who was assigned to what room. However, the chair didn't adopt this recommendation, and each concentration assessed students under criteria specific to their particular area, and there was no common program-wide assessment of students. Each program used a different assessment sheet and measured different criteria. At this point, Weave Online was being introduced, and the data entered was simply unmeasured, anecdotal information about our assessment results.
No, seems like the dark ages.
Yeah, it was. We had concurrently been working on NACID accreditation, and the department was up for its 6-year program review. We had a new chair at the time, and that chair asked you to work on the program review. Both you and I worked on the NACID committee and took assessment workshops that summer to familiarize ourselves with the assessment process. Because at the same time we were tasked with developing a new degree in graphic design and animation, this was useful because we could incorporate that into our new program. During the spring and summer of 2012, you completed the departmental program review. After lengthy discussions with institutional assessment, it became obvious the department needed to address the lack of data gathering and evaluation done in the name of assessments. Fall 2012, the new department chair combined the assessment committee and the curriculum committee into one robust committee. Their charge was to develop a program-wide, consistent, measurable assessment rubric that would evaluate all students in the department against agreed-upon consistent core competencies. Each competency could be weighted differently according to the student's level to accommodate different stages in the student's skill development and learning. During this time, the department added 0-credit assessment courses to the catalog. These courses were designed as graduation requirements. So students had to successfully pass with a score of 55 each of the 5 assessments. The assessment rubric developed in 2012 was transferred to an Excel worksheet. There were pull-down choices, and functionality made the scoring of the assessment easier and began to capture data in an application that could then be evaluated across the concentrations by student, by class, etc. In 2013, the Assessment and Curriculum Committee began to look at data gathered from the first 2 assessments to see if there was emerging areas of concern or misalignment with our stated learning outcomes. This process took 10 years and brings us to the point where you really have expertise on what we've been doing recently. So Wade, how do you assess a very subjective subject like art?
Well, the problem is that traditionally, student assessment of the visual art has been a very subjective practice. The professor comes in, looks at the work, decides whether he or she likes it. It looks at maybe at certain criteria based on a personally held philosophy. And the problem with this, of course, is you're not collecting any hard data. You're not being very objective about it, even though probably the professor would think so. The results are fairly opaque to the students. They can't really understand why they are strong in one area or weak in another. And it's just simply outdated for 21st century teaching. So moving off of the 6-year program review, it became pretty clear that there was near total subjective student assessment going on. Some were really fairly egregious. Each area was assessing differently, as you've already mentioned, and what this led us to was a very loud call for action.
What led you to see the need for greater objectivity? Was it external, internal?
Well, it's a little bit external, a little bit internal. External because by my interest in design education, I was seeing that other colleges and universities around the United States were going to much more objective rubrics and criteria or working with objective criteria with rubrics. So it was easy for us to see that there was a need for a common assessment rubric. For one thing, having a common assessment rubric across all of the areas, and when we're talking about the areas here, we're talking about art history, studio art, and graphic design. So that we're measuring in numbers and weights that are comprehensible to everyone involved in the assessment practice, and for accrediting bodies coming in to look at our assessment data. So with the common assessment rubric, we were aiming for more complete student data, which was leading to a better performance snapshot of the student work. Now in the art department, or now the theater, art and graphic and animation design department, we assess students 5 times. This is usually done annually, with the last 2 assessments being done within the senior year, at midpoint and at the final. So this gives us a pretty good idea in the summative assessments, which is what they are, of how the students are performing as freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and twice in their senior year. Putting together the rubric, we wanted to come up with criteria that was easy to understand, and easy to understand to a number of parties. Not only the faculty and the accrediting bodies that I mentioned earlier, but also to the students themselves. You know, what good is an assessment of the students if the students don't know why they are weak in one area or strong in the other? We also want to make the data easy to process when it came to the Assessment and Curriculum Committee to compile the data and look across the curriculum where the strengths and the weaknesses of the program or the curriculum might be. Overall, what we wanted was simply a more objective and transparent assessment rubric. So in building the rubric, and this goes back to the 6-year program review, we took the assessment data for 6 years and put it inside a matrix. And that matrix revealed to us the core competencies that were being assessed across the 3 areas. Again, art history, studio art, and graphic design. 5 core competencies, and they mostly aligned with the competencies of Longwood University. So we took the competencies, the 5 of them, and we set criteria under each one of the competencies. We allowed the different areas to have some leeway in how they would set the weights for the rubric itself. So I'll show you a rubric in a moment and explain a little bit more about the numbers. We also came up with a math formula that would allow us to not score all of the criteria if it was not applicable for that particular assessment, and not have that not applicable, or NA, affect the student's score. And then Chris, you came up with the idea of putting it into an Excel spreadsheet to make the math much, much easier, because artists and graphic designers are notorious bad mathematicians. So let's take a look at the spreadsheet. It's probably hard to see on the screen, but you can see the blocks running down the left-hand side. Those represent the 5 core competencies that we assess. And in the next column are the criteria. And what we have here are the different blocks with the different weights. You can see over the far right column, there are some weights assigned up there. Everything is uniform in the competencies and the criteria. All of those are used throughout all of the areas in the art department. But the difference comes in the weights, because obviously some of the areas you might not weight quite as tough or quite as heavy for a first-year student as you would for a senior. So this allows the areas to have a little bit of flexibility.
So, how have you been using this data? It has only started recently. How do you go about looking at the data, and is there anything that you anticipate will come out of this data?
Well, as I said before, we're collecting numbers on students in fairly finely diced criteria. So we can begin to see what areas where the students are falling down and where they are excelling. And what this allows us to do when the data comes in to be compiled by the Assessment Curriculum Committee, that we can compile the reports, send them out to the areas, and the areas can begin to talk about curricular changes that might need to be made. Now, because these are summative assessments, they're only done once a year. Obviously, some adjustments need to be made within the classroom, within the courses themselves, so the formative assessments can begin to build toward the changes that we see necessary to be made in the curricula. We'll continue to run pilot flights on the rubric. It's not set in stone. We'll probably continue to use the same rubric we have for about 3 years. So we can collect 3 years worth of data and see how we're working with those numbers. And then we'll make decisions at that point on where we need to go with the next stage with our assessment rubric. We like them because they're good for the students, and that was primarily our aim in the first place. The criteria is much more specific. As I mentioned before, it's much more finely diced so the students can see much more clearly where they're falling down or they're excelling. The strengths and weaknesses are much more clear to the students. And what this allows the students to do is to bring their assessment sheets into usually an advising session and have a dialogue with their instructors on how they can improve the things that they're weak on and maybe even get better with the things that they're strong in. And with the new program that we have in graphic and animation design, we're looking at these to maybe help the student make good career choices.
One last question. How do you think this is going to affect your accreditation?
Well, I think it can only help our accreditation. One of the conversations that you and I had with institutional advancement with Ling and Linda is how the 6-year program review was really a pilot for to find out what problems we had so we could begin to move toward NASAT accreditation. And accreditation has become very, very important, I'm sure, across a lot of disciplines, but particularly ours, which is graphic design and animation, where in talking with the NASAD folks in Washington, they're their accrediting body for art and graphic design and animation, they're having more and more parents call up and ask what accreditation means to a university or to a art, graphic design, or animation program. So it's only going to help. Well, I guess we've said all we need to say.
Yeah, if you have any questions, happy to answer them on the blog. So visit us on the blog, and have enjoyed telling you our experiences over the last 2 years.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.